kid, I used to play Superman, and I would swing my cape, and I would run through the house, and I would soar. What was that? Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Superman! Well, one day I was in the living room, and the family was there. I don't remember this. My family told me later. But my next oldest brother was in the chair sitting there, and I happened to run across a case knife. So I went, Superman, 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 and went right over to him, went poof, and stabbed him in the chest with a case knife. He lived. He forgave me. I was just a little kid. But it's amazing how we can get caught up in the Superman story, can't we? By the way, I ain't going to pull my cape off. It's the wrong color for me. Who said superheroes can't wear pink, right? Actually, this is my rag for when I wipe off my car. But anyway, we're going to talk about a story about someone we believe who is a Superman, but he really wasn't. Amen. You can be seated. Hey, I feel like Cam Newton. Woo! Yeah, don't tackle me. Superman. Today we are finishing up a series called Standing Alone. And I want you to turn in your Bibles to Judges. We will read at the end and then come back to the beginning because it's several chapters long. Let's go to Judges chapter 16. So I said we're going to talk to you. I want to talk to you about someone that we picture as a superhero. But when you get into the text and realize that what transpired, he really wasn't all that. So what does that have to do with Superman? Well, I liken Samson to Superman. We have this picture of Samson being this huge. He was sort of like the toast-colored Hulk of his day in our minds, right? If you get the picture, you remember the Incredible Hulk? Well, we kind of get the picture of Samson being that Incredible Hulk. But the problem with Samson is the same problem he had the same problem that Superman had. See, no one could defeat Superman unless they brought him near his kryptonite. And Samson lived a life where he abided near his kryptonite. Now think about this. As we go through this, we've all looked at the story. We know the story of Samson. He was physically strong, but yet he was spiritually and emotionally weak. Why was that? Because you see, he lived too close to what I call the edge of life. And you're going to see that in just a minute. He lived too close to the edge of life, and he was not able, even though he was strong, he was not able to keep himself up spiritually and emotionally through his physical strength. It's a lot like a Christian. You know, it's not really difficult to become a Christian, right? You just have to believe and have faith in Jesus Christ. But living out the Christian life, it requires a day-to-day walk in the Spirit of God. And there are all kinds of kryptonites around us wanting to draw our strength out. Now, our kryptonite doesn't come in a green-looking, emerald-looking stone, but it comes in the works of the flesh, the desires of our own flesh. Because think about it. We are faced with all kinds of temptations. Vanity. You could make a whole list. Vanity, greed, revenge, sensuality, desire for power. You know, our world is noisy with all these temptations that come streaming into our life every day. And the allurements that are around us. I mean, let's face it. You know why? Do you know why Christians in America only come to church 2 times a month? It's because of all the allurements that the world has to offer. Yeah, it's okay. We're talking about Cam Newton. It's okay to go to Panthers game, but if you're a Christian, you don't want to buy all the Sunday afternoon tickets because it's going to take you out of church. You follow what I'm saying? The point is that the allurements are out there. The allurements for fame, for fortune, for power, for pleasure. It's all around us. And we struggle with it every day. See, Samson was called by God to do a great work in Israel. But he fell to his kryptonite. And he ended up in the lap of Delilah. Let's look at chapter 16. And I'm going to read not the whole story. I'm going to read the end of the story. And let's start in verse 21. It says, "And then the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze chains, and he was a grinder in prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it was shaved off. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and rejoiced, for they said, 'Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands.' When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, 'Our God has given our enemy into our hands, even the destroyer of our country, who has slain many of us.' So it happened that when they were in high spirits, that they said, 'Call for Samson, that he might amuse us.' So they called for Samson from prison, and he entertained them, and they made him stand between the pillars. Then Samson said to the boy who was holding his hand, 'Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them.' And the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. About 3,000 men and women were on the roof looking on while Samson was amusing them. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, 'Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may at once be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes.'" See, that in itself gives us a glimpse into his character. Here he is, the judge of Israel, and he wants revenge on the people that gouged his eyes out. Anyway, it says, Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested and braced himself against them, the one with his right hand and the other with his left. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Now remember that phrase, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bent with all his might, so that the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it, so that the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. Samson. See, Samson's kryptonite never allowed him to stand alone. See, as I mentioned, we think of Samson like the Incredible Hulk. We think of Samson as this huge, muscular man. We picture Samson like Superman. Do they have a picture of Superman up there? Mm-hmm. When we think of Samson, we think of That does look a lot like Cam, doesn't it? But anyway, we see him as that way. But if you study the scriptures carefully, you'll see that all of his strength was given to him by God. Now, what we have to think about is, why were all these Philistines amazed over his strength and his power? You would assume that it's because he looks strong. That is not what attracted them, because you see, Samson didn't look like Superman. Samson looked like Clark Kent, the mild-mannered reporter. So what I'm saying is this, is that, see, Samson is not this picture that we should picture him as something extraordinary. We need to see him as Clark Kent. We need to see that Samson was an ordinary man who had the Spirit of God. And that's what amazed the Philistines. It wasn't that he could tear down the gates of the cities. It was because he could do that and look like Clark Kent. Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, I've got a little video I want to show you, because we all love the stories of all the superheroes, and now that we got a cuss buster, we actually got to watch part of a movie. It was one of those, I don't know what it was, one of the superhero things. Anyway, it was pretty cool. I like science fiction stuff, so my wife, she goes along with it. And it takes all the cussing out of it. So, there's bloodless kind of thing. So anyway, we watch those. But I want to show you a quick video of what kryptonite and how you deal with kryptonite.
Don't take another step.
Those are fighting words, Mr. Kent. Or should I call you Superman? Secret identity, now that's very clever.
You're going to prison, Trask, for murder, for kidnapping, for abuse of power.
Oh, but I'll tell everyone your little secret.
I don't care. This ends now.
I agree. The question is, for whom? You think you're better than humans, don't you? Lying around, oh so perfect and superior. Well, those days are over now, aren't they?
You're wrong.
No. As it happens, you are wrong. It's over now, and I have won, and this little piece of home is going to be the death of you, Superman. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for the services. And very foolish.
What did he have to do with the kryptonite? He had to get rid of the kryptonite. See, Samuel didn't start out as a loser. You say, well, I didn't think he was a loser. Yes, but if you look at his potential, you can see that it was a loser. His name was written in the book of Hebrews, the Hall of Faith. He was mentioned in there. But you'll see in just a few minutes that God had a bigger and better plan for Samson than what he ever lived out. As we said, he was an ordinary man. He wasn't born this way. He was born to be a deliverer of Israel. So he didn't start out as a loser. In fact, if you go back to Judges chapter 13, you can actually see, beginning in verses 1 through about 4 or 5, it says, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave them to the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Then it goes on to tell a story about this man of Zorah, family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife, and they were barren, didn't have any children. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said, now behold, he said, you're barren, and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son. Now, therefore, be careful not to drink wine or strong drink or any unclean thing, for behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the boy shall be a holy Nazarite to God from the womb. And he will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. You see, his birth was divinely announced, I believe, by what we would say would be a pre-Jesus. This was actually, if you look at the scriptures, they asked him his name, and he said his name was Wonderful. So it wasn't an angel, it was Jesus that actually came to them and said, God had conceived Samson in his own mind before he was ever birthed from his mother's womb. to be the deliverer of Israel. See, that Israel was under the control of the Philistines. But as a Nazirite, and we won't go back and look at it, but if you want to see what the Nazirite vow was all about, it comes from Numbers chapter 6. God gave it in Numbers 6, verses 1 through 7, about being a Nazirite. Some of the things that included, they were not to cut their hair, they were to have a very strict diet, and they were not to touch dead bodies. Samson violated all those. It means in verse 5, it says that his destiny, Samson's destiny, was clearly revealed by God to he and his family on who he was supposed to be and what he was supposed to do. He knew exactly that he would have been born to be the deliverer of Israel. And he had help. In verses 8 through 12, we see that his family was spiritual. His mother and dad, in fact, the angel came to his mother first, and then she told her husband, and then he prayed and said, Lord, show me this same person. And so Jesus, or the angel, came back and told him what was going to take place. And we see in the scriptures that his family were deeply, deeply spiritual. Do any of you in this home place here today understand that maybe that someone that you birthed has a call on from God, and you're a spiritual person, but they're not living it out? It happened even back then. They were committed to God to bring this boy up right in the fear and the admonition of the Lord. He was brought up to be a true Israelite. But you see, Samson fell to his kryptonite. Sad story. See, his kryptonite turned Samson. Now let's look at this in chapter 14. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's read the first 3 verses. Then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. Then his father and his mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among our own people that you would take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she looks good to me. Kryptonite. See, the lure of the lust caused Samson to lose his focus. God had called him from his mother's womb to be the deliverer of Israel. He knew his purpose and his destiny, which sometimes today people don't even know that, but he knew what God had asked him to do and called him to be. But he forgot who he was. He forgot who he was supposed to be. Why? Because it says very clearly, we're going to look at this, he was unchecked and passionate over women. Now, I know none of us have ever had an issue with women. It says there, think about this. Now, he went to Timnah, and he says he saw a woman. Now, it's okay to look. But his kryptonite took him further than he wanted to go. And then he began to lust after her, even though that God had said not to marry outside of the Israelite people, that it was a sin to marry outside of that. It didn't matter to him because she looked good to him. Looked good to him. See, his focus was on 2 things. His focus was on her physical appearance, and number 2, pleasing himself. He wanted her body. It didn't matter if he broke the laws, he wanted her. Now let me give you a little insight here. it says that he saw her in Timnah. Now, Timnah was on the border of Philistia and Israel, right at the border. It was a small village right on the border between these two countries. So what difference does that make? Now think, he was supposed to be the deliverer. He should have been in the central part of Israel near Jerusalem. But yet where was he? He was walking the edge of the temptation. The Philistines and Philistia are a type and a symbol of the world. In other words, he was trafficking among his enemies when he should have been already delivering Israel. He was out scoping out the females, and it wasn't just the Israelites. He was going after that strange flesh. He was living on the edge. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Have you ever been in trouble yourself where you found yourself living on the edge of a place you didn't need to go? He was at the very edge of destruction. Now, I couldn't help. I had to think. I thought about this because I remembered a verse of Scripture from Proverbs chapter 9. And verse 14, it says, she sits at her doorway on the heights overlooking the city. She calls out to the men going by who are minding their own business. Come in with me, she urges the simple. To those who lack good judgment, she says, stolen water is refreshing. Food eaten in secret tastes the best. But little do they know that the dead are there and her guests are in the depths of the grave. My friends, the devil knows your kryptonite. He knows what you are attracted to. He knows what will turn your switch on. And it doesn't have to be a woman. It could be a man. It could be marriage. It could be anything. Lust of the flesh, desires of the life. They could be anything. But he knows what works on you and I. Now, when I think about Samson, I mean, he was the judge of Israel, and yes, he should have been in Jerusalem somewhere near there as being the judge, because the judge at that time would sort of be like today, like a president of the country kind of thing. So here he was. He had enough free time that he was checking out the borders, scoping out for women. What I see in this is I see a man who never learned to control his leisure time. See, it isn't necessarily when you're at work is when kryptonite shows up. Kryptonite can show up in your leisure time. Kryptonite can show up when you're checking your emails. Kryptonite can show up when you're on Facebook. Kryptonite can show up when you're looking at your Twitter or tweeting someone. Kryptonite is everywhere. But what usually causes most people to fall is they get tempted during their leisure moments. See, he was careless with his kryptonite. He knew what his weakness was. Let me just give him credit. He was a smart man. Wow. Are you catching this? But let's move on. In Judges 14, verse 10, it says, and then his father went down to the woman, and Samson made. Do they still make that? I guess they do. And Samson made a feast there for the young men. In other words, he's getting married, okay? And for the young men, let me start over. Then he and his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for the young men customarily did this. When they saw him, they brought him 30 companions to be with him. Now, these aren't Israelites. These are Philistines. Then Samson said to them, now let me propound a riddle for you. If indeed you will tell it to me within 7 days of the feast, and find out, then I will give you 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. But if you're unable to tell me, then you shall give me 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes. And they said, propound your riddle that we may hear it. And he said, so he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. 3 days they didn't have an answer. He gives them a riddle. I have to ask the question, why in the world is the deliverer of Israel, who's supposed to be, hanging around Philistines? And we have to ask ourselves the same thing. You know, we've heard the statement, we are in the world, but we're not to be of it. Sometimes we shouldn't surprise ourselves if you're hanging around Philistines. The Bible says that bad company corrupts good morals. He had no business even toying with these people. But let's don't stop there. Let's go on to chapter 16 and you'll see him get involved again. This is 20 years later. You think the man had grown up. 20 years later, in verse 1, it says, Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went to her. Right after that. See, when kryptonite has this insatiable, has this desire, even though it can kill us, it has the desire to make us want more. The devil will give you a pleasurable thing, wanting to get so that you'll go for more of the pleasure. But in the end, it'll lead to death. I'm preaching better than you're shouting here. So he becomes sexually involved with this harlot. And then by verse 4, guess what? And after this came about, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. We know the story of that. Instead of seeking the will of God, he was seeking pleasure with the opposite sex. Now, that's his kryptonite. Ask the person beside of you, what's your kryptonite? Don't tell them. See, in the life of every Christian, there is a lingering kryptonite somewhere, hidden in the shadows, waiting for us to get too close to the world. So I see a man here who could not control his emotions. He could not control his body. He could not control his leisure time. He was out of control. Now in chapter 16, verse 5, we see another key unlocked. I think I want to do verse 5. Think about this. So he loved this woman, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him. Then we will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Why was he even familiar, not with the Philistines, but the lords of the Philistines? They were part of his circle of people that he hung around with. They wanted to know the source of his strength, because you remember, he looks like Clark Kent to us. And they can't figure out where he gets all this power. But we see here very clearly, in fact, in chapter 16 and verse 16, you can see that it says that after she plotted to get all the information from him, he finally relented, and because it says that his soul was annoyed to death. Here's a man who couldn't control his mind, he couldn't control his emotions, he couldn't control his body, or he just wouldn't. So what does that say to you and I? Well, there are repercussions when you play with kryptonite. Because it says in that text, in verse 20, it says, he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Wow. He was so far out there, caught up in the lust of the flesh and all this kryptonite material, living the way he wanted to live and not answering the call of God, he didn't recognize that God had left him. What a sad statement. In other words, Samson became the victim of his own desires. He refused to manage those desires. And we see in verse 19 of that chapter 16, it says, and she made him sleep on her knees. Or other translation says, he laid his head in Delilah's lap. Delilah was not an Israelite. Delilah was a Philistine. My friends, if you meet someone, if you're shopping, I'm just saying this, if you're shopping for a mate, and you're hoping that you can do some missionary conversion work, you are deeply deceived. You need to go back to the house of Israel and find you a man or a woman that's already a part of the family of God, and don't go out there shopping around finding someone that just simply pleases your eye. Wow. He refused to manage all these desires, and here he ends up in the lap of Delilah. Now think about this. He had been called by God to be a Nazirite. But it says in verse 17, so he told her that it was what was in his heart, because she kept bugging him. You know the story. I'm not going to go through all of it. And he said to her, a razor has never come on my head, for I have been a Nazirite from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. A man will do almost anything for sex. He'll tell you anything. He'll give you anything for the moment. But he's only interested in one thing. He's not interested in your security. He's interested in your body. You say, well, that's pretty crude. Well, God, you see, God created man in the first unabridged edition to be perfectly pure and holy. But when sin entered in, we know the rest of the story. In other words, what does all this mean? Well, instead of being a deliverer, Samson needs deliverance. The man called of God, who was supposed to set Israel free, is now needing freedom himself. He became hostage to the very ones he was supposed to conquer. That's why you have to be careful when you share your faith. You don't go into places where you're outnumbered. People, I've seen this over the years, people, they get saved and they want to go back to the same bar they used to hang out in. I say, no, you don't need to do that. Oh yeah, I'm going to go back and I'm going to preach Jesus to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For a couple of days, and then after a couple of more days, and then they slide a little toddy over next to you, or a Bud Light or something like that, and then you're your buddies again, and then you're right back where you started from. It's a shame. It's a sham. I can't believe that he did this. See, he actually diffused his destiny because he couldn't control himself. Wow. 20 years he judged Israel. And then in verse 30 he says this, let me die. Why didn't he say let me die with the Israelites? You know, you think if you were loyal to your nation, to your God, if you're going to die, you'd want to die with your people. But he says, let me die with the Philistines. And we know the story, we just read it. Now think about this. It says that 3,000 people were killed that day. More than he had killed during his whole lifespan as judge. He killed 3,000. when he should have destroyed the entire nation. That is not a superhero. Because see, God did not want a nation to exist or have anyone in it when he says, I want you to conquer it. He meant, when he says, I want you to conquer it, that means you wipe everybody out. So little he did when he had so much potential. He tore the lion apart with his bare hands. And then the foolish fella goes out and comes back by there later on, and he finds that a beehive has developed in the carcass of that old lion, and that's where he got the riddle about something sweet coming out of something that was strong. But yet, as a Nazarite, he was not to touch a dead body. He actually gathers honey from it and gives it to his family and eats it. It's amazing. So here he was, a man who was to deliver the nation, and he kills 3,000 people. Now, that's a lot of people, but when you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that should have been utterly wiped off the map because they were so despicable, serving this Dagon and hating the Israelites and destroying them, he ends up with a measly little 3,000. But you know what? I see a thread of mercy in that. At least he did that much. What have we done? So what do? Well, I would do what Superman did on this little video. We should get the kryptonite out of our life. How do I get the kryptonite? Anybody in here, you know what I'm talking about when I say kryptonite? Is there a little smidge of kryptonite hanging around in your household? See, you don't shout. What do? How do I get to victory over kryptonite? Well, there's a couple of things I thought of. Focus, this is one thing, focus on the spiritual and not the physical. You know, some people, this boggles my mind how Christians can think so carnally. They think everything has to do with the things they can see and taste and touch and smell. But God has recreated us as higher beings in that perspective, and that we're to see spiritually. We are to think spiritually. We are to speak spiritually and not get caught up in the carnal things. So number one, focus on the spiritual, not the physical. Number two, guard your leisure time. The cell phone, the computer, the movies, wherever your kryptonite lurks. Be careful with your leisure time. It is, when a man's working, we are so focused, all we can think about at that moment is work. This happens, my wife understands this, been married as long as we have. You know, she'll call me during the day and I'll be in the office here and I'll be doing something, and she knows she's not going to get a lot of conversation out of me, because I'm caught in the moment of doing what I'm supposed to do. So there's not an issue there with most men while you're, quote, working when your hands are busy, but lay all that stuff down, get rid of the toys for a moment or whatever it might be, and then that's where the kryptonite creeps up. So guard your leisure time. Number three, this is a novel thing, screen your companionship. Don't be like he was and going up to Timnah, which was right on the border of the Philistines. He should have never been even close to that place. You know, if you have an issue with drugs, then there's certain places in town you don't want to go to. There's certain people you don't want to associate with. You want to hightail it out as quickly as you can. We need to be careful who our companions are and screen them through the screen of the Holy Spirit. Lord, is this somebody I need to be connected to? Now, if you work with them, you have no choice, and God will grace you with the power to lead a Christian life even among them. But it doesn't mean that you're going to sit down and have lunch with them every day and listen to their dopes talk and all these things and then think that you're not going to be affected. And then, so that number one, focus on the spiritual rather than the physical. Number two, guard your leisure time. Number three, screen your companions. And number four, and if the church would learn this, we would be better off. Fulfill your vows to God. Samson had made a vow, even though he was preordained of God to be a Nazirite. He confirmed it with his own words, but he never kept his vow as a Nazirite. His word was not as good as his actions. He could not make his yes a yes and his no a no. And that's why he couldn't stand alone. That's why he didn't bring deliverance to Israel. That's why he didn't fulfill his destiny and his purpose for life. Because he would not separate. See, he was a Nazirite on the outside, but a playboy on the inside. He had the looks of the long hair. He could sort of appear to be a Nazirite, even confess that he was a Nazirite, but on the inside, he was a playboy. He couldn't control his kryptonite. How many Christians do we know like that today? So I challenge you. What's your kryptonite? Let it sink in. What is your kryptonite? You say, why am you asking me this? Because until you observe it, you'll never deal with it. We have to see our own weaknesses. We have to understand where we can most easily fall short. We need to observe ourselves and say, this is where my kryptonite creeps in. So what do I do if I observe it? Well, you pre-plan to avoid it. This is a big thing in society today is all the pornography on the computers and cell phones. I mean, well, a cell phone is a computer. So how do if that's an issue for you, how do you guard it? Well, there's plenty of software out there that can block it. You can take up the risk on your computer, when you're surfing the web, where you can X that stuff out. Some may just need to not go on. But Pastor, how can I live without internet? Well, you did before. I grew up almost totally normal with a 3-party telephone line. Where you had to, if you wanted to make a private call, you had to go to a phone booth. Kind of like Superman when he went to change clothes. He would find a phone booth. Now you can't even find a phone booth. So don't tell me you can't live without your cell phone. If it is your kryptonite, then you need to lay it. I'm not saying to throw it away completely, but lay it down, turn it off, take the battery out of it, do something till you break the habit of being on it and going to those places that you don't need to be going. Hanging on the thread of disaster between the good and the sanctified and the unholy. Now this goes with, I don't know why I'm focusing on that, but apparently somebody's struggling with that. Let me close with this. James said it this way in James 1, verse 13. He says, and remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. And when sin is allowed to grow, everyone say that with me. When sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Say that. It gives birth to death. Say it one more time. When sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So what poses the greatest threat to your spiritual life? What is that one temptation? And yours could be something more simple. It could, this could be a temptation. You could be so caught up in your family that your family is bigger than God. So the temptation could be anything. In other words, when you make choices that overrule God's word to appease your children or your spouse or your family, then that's kryptonite. See, sometime in our lives, we've got to make a stand. Now, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And when my kids were under my roof, and I fed them, and I had insurance on them, and I put clothes on their back, and we carried them around to every activity that we thought was best for them, then they did what we said they were going to do. You will not ruin your child by making them come to church. And this troubles me when I see strong Christian parents, just like Samson's parents, who are raising them up in the right way. And then you get one against, when they get 13, they go ballistic, most kids. The hormones kick on and they know more than you. They're smarter than you. And don't you laugh, because we were thinking the same thing when we were that age. See, I needed my mama there was no option in my house. Now, I didn't get saved during that time, but it sure made an impact on my life. And so if you've got kids and, I don't feel like going to church today, those are fighting words. It doesn't take but about 3 seconds to pull out the belt. And you whoop them all the way to church, and they come in. If they're 13 years old, it's okay. But as long as they're eating your food and under your house, they need to listen to you. Now, when they get out on their own, that's a different story. But while they're there, they need to listen to you. I'm talking to somebody. Because you see, now your children have become gods. They have become your kryptonite. You have bowed the knee to Baal to follow their ungodly ways. They don't know any better. They're just kids. Listen, even in their 20s, they're still kids. Sometimes they're still kids when they're 30s. And there might be some in here that are still children at 40 or 50. I mean, Samson never grew up. He was a wimp of a man on the inside. Even though he was a judge and ruler of Israel, he still did not have that tenacity, that manhood he needed. He was still taking revenge when he died. What a shame. I got one more for you. If you've got kryptonite in your life, do one more thing. Make yourself accountable to someone else. Now, it doesn't mean you say, well, I want you to be accountable. I want to be accountable to you. And then this is how they'll qualify. And if you see anything in me, I want you to tell me. You missed it. Being accountable to someone is not saying, well, if you see something wrong in my life, then hold me accountable. Now, that's good, but that's not the essence of it. The essence of it is that if you're making yourself accountable to someone else spiritually, you need to tell them about your kryptonite. And you need to say, you need to pray for me. You need to keep me in check over this segment of kryptonite. Because you see, like Superman, the only way he could destroy or not be destroyed by his kryptonite was to throw it as far away as he could get it. Enough said. Kryptonite. Temptation. I asked the Lord how He wanted me to close these short moments out. I want everybody to stand up. You know, I love to give altar calls, and I do it quite often. But you know, sometimes you do a better job as a church, being where you are, that you be the altar where the call was made. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to close just a little bit different today. We're going to deal with our kryptonite. Now I want you to look at the person beside of you and just say to them, kryptonite. Just say to them, kryptonite. So now we know what the subject of our closing is all about, is kryptonite. Now this is not a confessional of sin. This is prayer over our kryptonite. Remember we talked about just now about being accountable. So we're going to do things, we're going to do this. Let's do this. Let's do men with men and women with women. Maybe groups of 4 max. 3 to 4 people. So we aren't here all afternoon praying over our kryptonite. Because some of us may have a longer list than others. This is going to be our challenge today. Now, you can stand in your group and you can pray for people. And you don't have, no one's going to force you to name or label your kryptonite. And you can walk out of here with your kryptonite.